Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see all of you who are here in person and those of you joining us online, and whenever you do join us online or take in. We are very thrilled to have a very special guest with us, King Julez. And it is kind of interesting that we had a coronation today. And we have King Julez as well, and there's going to be a special little gift in here. We'll talk about that later, but we are thrilled, and we're looking forward to learning and engaging and hopefully expanding our horizons. So without further ado, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm here this afternoon, and whenever you're watching online, good to see you. As mentioned, my name is King Julez. I'll get a little bit into myself in a moment here, but I want to just say thank you. And if at any point you need to get up, stretch, move around, sit on the floor, look at some books, do whatever you need to do, we're all humans that have needs, so feel free to meet your needs whenever you need to. I'll give a little bit of a layout of our time together. There are some of the books at the back that are printed up here. Again, some that have informed my thinking, have informed this presentation. I do recommend maybe taking a picture of them or taking a flip through at some point today. We're going to go through the various kinds of art that have influenced drag throughout a lot of history. This is going back to pre-400 CE, so really, really long time ago. We're going to talk a little bit about Judith Butler, who is a really great theorist and scholar, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Bible and performance. We are in a church, after all, so I'll tie that in a little bit at the end. There are likely three kinds of performance that you are familiar with. The first is fakery, right? An inauthentic ruse to present oneself as something one is not. That's not what I'm doing here, and that's not a lot of what I'm talking about, but that is one kind. The second way of understanding performance is probably the most common, and that is through the artistic realm of theater, which I'm sure at least some of you are familiar with. The third type of performance that I aim for, and that some of these theories aim for, comes from gender and queer theory, Judith Butler being a huge influence on that. The idea here is performance as a practice of constituting selves and communities. And I'll get more into that after a little history lesson here. So first, who am I? Why am I relevant? Why am I here talking to you right now? My name is King Julez, as Harris lovely said. I use they, them pronouns all the time, whether I'm in drag or out of drag. I live and work here in Toronto, which, as we know, is stolen territory. I am a fourth generation, white, Canadian-born, English and Scottish settler. I am non-binary, I am trans, in a variety of ways that word is used. I'm a drag performer, and I say that because I'm not a drag queen, I'm not a drag king anymore, but simply someone who pushes those boundaries a little bit more every time. I've been finding more and more enjoyment in my clown drag, as we see it here today, as it sort of developed. One, because there's no gender to a clown. You'll notice that in a lot of other circus spaces and a lot of other spaces. I love also that I get to just be goofy, silly, as colorful as possible. I find the ugliest thing on the shelf in the thrift store and I just add it to the clown wardrobe. It's perfect. I love it so much. There's always something there. I'll get, again, more into why the clown drag makes sense for ministry later in this conversation. I've been into drag for about 4.5 years, which, adding that up, is a little bit terrifying. I didn't think it was that long. But I only seriously started thinking about it with my ministry within the last 2 years because of one of the books that's back there on the table that was written by the director of the MDiv program at Emmanuel College, Natalie Stevenson. Talks about theology as performance art. And so I'm reading this book as I'm doing drag and I'm doing church, and all of a sudden it clicks to me that it can come together in a way that's so meaningful for me and to also embody the history of queerness that came before me. I've been a part of the United Church of Canada my whole life. I've been working towards ministry for a very, very long time. Think the story of Samuel when he was a kid, thinking that Eli's calling him from the other room. I had a similar experience to that when I was a kid, and it made no sense to me. And then the Sunday following, we read that story in Sunday school, and I felt like I got hit by a truck. So that's sort of the beginning of my call story there for you. I sit as the co-chair on the council of Affirm United, it's up on the ensemble, you'll see down in the corner here. That's an organization that works within and beyond the United Church to provide resources to congregations that want to call themselves capital A affirming. And so we provide worship resources, we provide workshops, we engage communities with one another. It's really quite beautiful work that's been around since the 80s. So I'm really, really lucky to be there. I sit as one of the co-directors of the Dragon Spirituality Summit. We just had our first one in Chicago this past October. It was awesome. And we're doing another one in San Francisco this year, and next year it will be in Toronto, hopefully at Emmanuel College. If any of you there are seeing this, please. So keep your eyes peeled for 2024. This summit is going to be really fabulous. For me, I discern my call to ministry the same that I do my transition and my drag. For those of you that maybe have listened to the CDC interview, maybe read the article in Broadview Magazine, you've delved into this a little bit. Each and every day I wake up and I ask myself sort of what makes sense for me today. And for me, in my own journey, my own spirituality, my own transition, that's what works for me. For every single person, it's different, and so I can't say for other people what that might mean, but that's me listening to my sense of self. Whenever I get into drag, I don't go into it with a plan. And this has become very fun when I am going and leading worship or guest preaching somewhere, is I will wake up in the morning. I usually do this while the sun is rising. I have eastward-facing windows in my apartment. And I go over the order of service, maybe read my sermon, maybe finish my sermon, and then I pick whatever colors kind of stand out to me. And about a half dozen times now it's happened that I will do that, and I will go to the church that I've never been to before, and the colors on my face are the ones in the sanctuary. And that'll be the stained glass windows, that can be the banners, that can be the carpet, but it's happened a number of times. And I think that's a divine nudge in the right direction if I ever heard one. So we're going to start in history long ago, the arts of glamour and performance. And so this includes, of course, campy, over-the-top, fabulous alter egos. You'll see some listed here. Mine, Shakespearean theater, Kabuki theater, Kathakali, the Peking opera, vaudeville in France. Some of these names you may have heard before, but they all have an influence on this art form here. In the top left here, we see some Greek mime, which is very similar to where a lot of clowns get some of their work today. Using a combination of dance and interaction with audience members, mimes entertained at festivals telling stories. The most famous mimes were the ones who broke the chains, broke the chorus, and were always over the top. In the middle here, in the top, up there, we see Shakespearean theater. While women were barred from the stage, men took over. Shakespeare's heroines aren't necessarily central characters unless they are the one that's going to cross-dress, such as Viola in Twelfth Night. Gender was a complicated role in a lot of Shakespearean theater. The top right is a Kathakali dance, typically performed by men and traditionally based in Hindu folklore. These dances told stories through elaborate dance, music, singing, and a lot of costumes. The bottom left here, you'll see the Peking opera in China, which originated in the 18th century. Of course, music and glamorous makeup were at the core, but there was a fresh emphasis on acrobatics, which was new. They also were extremely colorful palettes that set the opera apart from the rest. The leading female roles, called the Dan, could only be played by men until 1912, so just over 100 years ago. These male performers were particularly demure makeup compared to their counterparts' intricate patterned faces. They were intricate, embellished silk robes, and among the original drag artists they are considered. The middle bottom here, you'll see a really beautiful Japanese setup for Kabuki theater. This was originally begun by a woman, and she built a troupe and they danced in typical male clothing, so much different from some of the other things that we're talking about here. In 1629, women were banned from the Kabuki theater by the government because they were featured to be too erotic. This led to a rise in the Onagata, which are men artists playing female roles, similar to what was going on in Shakespearean theater. They were dedicated to soft beauty, femininity, delicate. While the plot lines have grown more complex over the last 400 years, the dancing and traditional costumes, as well as the spaces that they're held in, remain largely unchanged. And in the bottom right here is actually a picture from one of the books back there. We'll see the Cossack and Sengi performers of the Ottoman Empire, so that's 1300 to 1922, so a really big span of time here. While the harems of women dancers are well known in that area, they were male counterparts as well, that belly danced to music, and were in those same spaces. These entertainers wore curled hair, long silk shirts, heavy makeup that created a really big overall effect. And it's rumored in a lot of the world that the male dancers were actually at higher demand than the women. Here we can see the vaudeville theater troupe up in the top left here. These are groups originating in France and then of course elsewhere that would combine comedy with satirical songs to create an all singing, all dancing mega showcase. Drag artists naturally gravitated to this kind of humor and poking at the world, right? This became an opportunity to poke and joke and poke holes in gender with really, really big audiences. Pantomime theater in Britain was the beginning of many drag king careers. There's some pictured up here, as you'll see. Women were landed for principal boy parts such as Peter Pan, not surprising. And the cross-dressing world became a gag in the shows themselves. In these two theaters, artists understood that a little bit of laughter made the illusion just a little bit easier for the audience to grasp. We still see this in copious amounts today in a lot of various kinds of theater, as well in drag. Florence Hines, who's up there in the middle, was a black drag king who began as part of the Creole show, which was put on in deviation from the time's popular racist minstrel shows, if you've ever heard of those. Florence Hines was dapper, fashionable, and an upper-class eccentric, reportedly earning the highest salary of any black woman at the time. There's Ella Shields and Anne Hingle here. While there were drag artists and stars at the time, cross-dressing was illegal in most US states during this time. When cross-dressing took place anywhere but on stage, people were not forgiving. Now at this time in Canada, there's ample evidence that queer lives and experiences were going on too. Of course, a lot of these records have been destroyed, have been censored, have been hidden away. But there's a couple of examples here that I'll go through. In the Halifax Gazette in 1752, there were sodomitical practices being reported. This is the first printed newspaper in what we now know as Canada, and that's what they were reporting. Dr. James Berry, who's up in the right here, saved countless lives in the mid-1800s as the Inspector General of Hospitals in what we now know as Canada, but was then the province of Upper Canada. He was discovered to have been born female only after his death and after his wildly successful career in 1865. Moise Keller's shop in Montreal, here in this corner, served as a place where men met each other and they had sex. The bakery and cake shop served as a front for what would be named reputably Canada's first gay establishment. It was raided by police frequently, and the heart, however, of the gay community in Montreal. And arguably Canada's first queer publication, Les Mousses Fantastiques, a bi-monthly publication devoted to the arts, was started by poet and philosopher Elsa Glado and poet-journalist Roswell George Mills in Montreal in 1917. And we go back to have some influences on the glamour that exists. This is the 1900s to the 1950s, the realness over the campy art forms that we were just looking at amidst the jazz age in the United States. Now, some of these names up here might look familiar to you: Marlene Dietrich, Josephine Baker, some very popular artists at the time. Now we'll go the left to right here. Julien Meltinge, his drag revolved around the full feminine fantasy, which, whatever that means now, meant a very specific thing back then. This included flawless makeup, intricate wigs, glamorous gowns, often convincing audiences that he was a woman, and having protests once they figured out he wasn't. Elton worked at the same time as someone named Bert Savoy, who took a different route, far more over the top, and coining phrases like we use today, like, "You slay me, and you don't know the half of it." So much of what we say and where our slang comes from these historic queer elders. The Rocky twins in the center at the top, their looks were signature 1920s, as you can probably tell by the image up there. Sporting short wigs, rimmed eyeliner, and bright lips, they wore flapper gowns and stoles. As men, they wore tuxedos and polished shoes. Their image was consistent no matter what role they were playing. Josephine Baker, the icon up in the top right here, she built her reputation as a vaudeville star and moved to Paris, finding fame as a dancer, as an actress, as an entertainer. She performed femininity in an over-the-top way, as deliberate as drag artists were doing. She mastered a campy, sexy appeal that drew audiences and earned her the name Queen of Paris. This young, queer, black woman made the white audiences around her marvel and question about how they saw performance as she continued to shine and inspire and be a star. On the bottom here we see Marlene Dietrich. She spent her entire career toying with these ideas of gender. Switching between tuxedos and feathers and veils, she used each role that she landed to challenge the stereotypes of both masculinity and femininity. Gladys Alberta Bentley, down here at the bottom, was a huge star of the Harlem Renaissance in the US. She began her career when she replied to an ad for a male pianist. So she cross-dressed, or she got dragged up for the interview. She landed the job. She flirted with women in the audience and hammered away on the keys. She captured her audiences. As a black, gendered, non-conforming lesbian, she was a trailblazer. In the early 20th century of the US, silent films were starting to show drag characters. Typically, drag was the punchline, and the actors relied on bad costumes and masculine mannerisms. The Chaplin brothers, however, committed more wholly to the feminine illusion in films like The Masquerader or Charlie's Aunt. The Jewel Box Revue was an all-age drag performance troupe that was founded in 1939 following a strict crackdown on drag in queer communities in the 1930s. The troupe spawned many stars and always focused on blending elegance with witty entertainment. In Japan, the railway president built a music school in hopes to boost tourism and ticket sales to the coastal resort of Takarazuka. His idea was to train a troupe of girls and women to perform, but more commonly with Western practice than with Japanese tradition. The Takarazuka troupe was formed in 1914. Let's see on the top left here. The troupe was so successful they kept performing through both world wars. Becoming more flamboyant over time, the makeup and costume vary for each production, but the key feature of this troupe is that women play both male and female roles. This troupe is still functioning today and still functions under that same realm. Victor Victoria is a 1933 German language film, which some of you may know, some of you might not, that's fine. This depicted the life of a struggling actress who follows advice to become a female impersonator. This is a standout film because it showed what we know now, but what wasn't a popular idea at the time was that women could be amazing drag queens, just like the men could. The film brought the art of drag to a more mainstream audience while staying true to the 1920s aesthetics. It was remade in the 1980s with Julie Andrews, which hopefully is a name that you know. The bottom left here is Stormy de Larvie Bury, so she joined the Jewel Box Revue, becoming the MC and the first ever drag king, but was a singer long before joining the troupe. Was a prominent activist in the scene and admittedly has been rumored to have thrown the first punch in the infamous Stonewall riots. The bottom right is Lynn Carter, Laverne Cummings, both here. Both members of the Jewel Box Revue. Carter was a celebrity impersonator doing a famous Josephine Baker, who we just learned about. Laverne was also known primarily for their vocal range and the ability to switch between the highs and lows. Detailed drag and charismatic personalities scored these two very, very impressive careers. The Second World War effort found millions of Canadians and newfies, who eventually became Canadians, segregated into gender-specific areas. So this posed a huge disruption to the authoritative hold that heteronormativity had in this country at that time. Arguably, still has in this time. Post-war Canada was invested in a traditional nuclear family. This pushed queer people back to the lives that existed sort of pre-war. Following World War II, there was an economic boom that allowed a middle class to develop and the suburbs to rise. The suburbs, of course, were seen as refuges for affluent white families and thus became bastions for racial and class conformity. World War II caused a huge shift in the ways that gender was organized. in the social and political world. Men left to fight, women took out a life outside of the home and organized around the homosocial unit, rather than heterosexual one. Close relationships as well developed between soldiers on the front lines, so much so that differentiating between a platonic friendship and the homoerotic romance was very, very difficult. Even cross-dressing was a regular event on soldiers' trips as a morale-boosting endeavor rather than a gay thing. There's little evidence, however, of homosexual desires from this era in written materials, likely as a result, as I mentioned before, of heavy censorship and the careful nature of the writers. Homophobic laws at this time as well targeted visible manifestations of queerness, and as we continue to see today, cross-dressers, drag artists, all the people sort of within that realm are harassed by police. They're often assaulted as well. There are a couple names up here. No, there's not, just kidding. This design in the middle here is from Ronald McRae. So this was a Canadian artist, designer, and illustrator in the 1920s. Vogue New York City was where he worked, which is pretty remarkable. An openly gay man, he participated in New York City drag balls and queer subcultures, and upon his return to Canada, he developed his illustration collection of fashionable women, which is what is put up there. St. Charles Tavern in the 1970s was a location here in Toronto. I'm not sure if any of you may have heard of this or were around when that was a really popular thing. The Halloween drag balls were an annual event there, which was an offshoot from the Letros Tavern that threw these balls in the 1950s and 1960s. Crowds of onlookers would, of course, protest and throw eggs at any of the participants. In 1979, nearly 2,000 people gathered at the tavern and were protesting and throwing eggs and just pelting the participants with any kind of hardship they possibly could. This is this photo up here. When the police intervened in 1979, this was after a decade of lobbying from queer community members pushing for them to finally help and do something similar to the police today. The University of Toronto Homophile Association, we'll see this down here, was an organization developed at the University of Toronto and was the city's first gay liberation organization and the first gay student organization in all of Canada. This was created in 1969. One of the founders wrote a letter to the editor of the Globe and Mail, labeling himself as the founder and combating some hate mail that the editors were getting about the club, and he was terminated from his position as a lab assistant days after the letter was published. This group here is traced as the origins for the present-day U of T group, LGBT Out. And so still, to this day, there are remnants of that work. Gladly Bookshop. I'm wondering how many of you have ever been there? If any of you. Maybe one, a couple of you. So this is a bookshop that now is housed on Church Street, right near Church and Wellesley. But Moldenhauer, one of the founders of the Homophile Association, started Gladly Bookshop in 1970. This was in response to the censorship laws that were going across the country on gay material. So while this bookstore remains a staple for the queer community in Toronto, they still, to this day, face censorship issues that caused the bookstore's origins. They've had product held at customs frequently being cited as obscene. Employees of the shop used to become targets for what was called the morality department of the police. And they still push for a lot of queer literature and things that you don't see at other bookstores. Jim Egan, up on the left here, was Canada's first publicly gay liberation activist, arguably, and began a letter-writing campaign in the 1950s. In May 1950, one of his letters was published in the Globe and Mail and Flash, a publication at the time. Gilda was a female impersonator, in Montreal in the 1950s until her death in 2012. As a cabaret performer, she embodied gestures, vocal inflections, and mannerisms of female celebrities. Ricky Tick worked as a burlesque dancer in Toronto and was also a center figure in cross-dressing performance in the 1960s, seen in the center. Jackie Shane regularly performed at the Sapphire Tavern in Toronto in the 60s, and Jackie's gender was always up for the audience's speculation. Later in life, she identified as a woman and emphatically eschewed all labels that people threw threw at her. Gay, down here in the corner, Gay. This began publishing in Toronto in March 1964. The tabloid featured a variety of content, and the first edition printed only 500 copies and sold out almost immediately. It was renamed Gay International in January 1965, but unfortunately stopped publishing only a few months later. I don't know if you can read some of the things that it says here. Sexually stimulated by high heels. Male menopause, story on page 2. I don't know, I think that'd be pretty fun to read. Some more artistic influences, the arts of freak and of war. So this is the 1950s through the 1970s. Carrying on the tradition of challenging social norms, drag queens challenged oppressive systems and openly fought for their rights as queer people, not just performers on a stage for people to look at. Wider society began to understand drag entertainers as more than just entertainers. They were fighters, they were activists, they were leaders in the community. We've already seen some popular performers being involved in activism, and the parallel between the two only increases through time. In 1959, what is thought to be America's first queer uprising happened in Los Angeles. Actually, this donut shop was tucked away in what was known as the queer ghetto, and therefore, police officers routinely came and harassed patrons. Unsurprising, right? On the night of one night in May, 1959, the police were met with violent resistance after attempting to arrest 5 people there. While reinforcements came quick, the small uprising set the tone for what would happen in the coming years. The underground ball culture developed as a subculture to the increasingly popular ball culture. The underground, however, was focused on Black and Latinx artists. At balls prior to the 1960s, thrown by white people, people of color were expected to lighten their faces if they were able to participate at all. After the 1960s, the development of the underground ball culture and the house system, as we know it today, was meant to be devoid of racism while still centering the competitive nature of the queer, gender, and dance presentations. This is really well showcased in the 1990 film, Paris is Burning. If you haven't seen that film, highly recommend it, highly recommend it. The balls were a way for these artists to live in a fantasy or an identity that the social structures of the time wouldn't allow them to live in. Getting emails. Up in the top here, we see Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, alongside the aforementioned Stormy DeLarverie, as well as many others. Here's Paris is Burning up here. They were some of the leaders during the Stonewall riots. Stonewall Inn, at the time, was a worn-down bar that was managed by managed by a mafia, so they could skirt around the liquor license requirements and hopefully fend off the police for a decent amount of time. On June 28, 1969, plainclothes police officers raided Stonewall, checking IDs, invading bathrooms. Patrons began to immediately refuse cooperation and taunt the police officers in and outside of the bar. I went to a speaking engagement a couple weeks ago where there was an activist there who was at the Stonewall riots, and he was telling me that people outside were ripping up pieces of paper, throwing them at the police and saying, "Here's my phone number, call me later," and then running away. I think it's hilarious. There was a lot going on at Stonewall at the time. A lot of people standing up for each other, a lot of people poking at the police. Again, this was led by Black community members, by trans community members, by drag artists. Gender nonconforming people of color led the revolution. And they banded together to found organizations such as STAR, Marsha P. Johnson's organization here, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. Crystal LaBeija, who's in the center up there, and the becoming of mother of the House of LaBeija. In the film, The Queen, she comes third runner-up and exits the stage in a rage. She ends the film with strong words about how she felt the competition was rigged, and of course the white queen won. She was, and continued to be, fed up with the discrimination that Black and Latin performers were facing. In the 1970s, Crystal and another queen named Lottie created a ball that would birth the house system as it is today. Crystal becoming, like I mentioned, the mother of the House of LaBeija, where there are still artists around the US taking on that family name and honoring her legacy. The house was meant to provide not only support and care for those without a blood family tie, but also offering medical assistance and protection for the members of the house. quickly becoming communities of refuge for many, many queer youth. You ever see a couple of drag queens with the same name? They're probably in the same house. The arts of war and freak, as they continued in the 1960s through the 1980s, they were intended to disrupt and cause more confusion even sometimes. Filth, scandal, horror, of course, sex. Freakiness has always been a part of the art form, but this era led to many forms of rebellion. While this era was important for the freakiness and the art of development and weird, in Toronto, there was an event that's deemed the Canadian parallel to the Stonewall riots. The Toronto bathhouse raids took place February 5th, 1981. Around 200 police officers raided Toronto bathhouses and made hundreds and hundreds of arrests. Most of those who were arrested faced taunts and harassment from the police, again, unsurprising and very on brand for the police, and then were later released after being found innocent for everything that they were accused of. The protests that followed these raids marked a turning point not only for Toronto's gay community, but for our whole country. The following evening, a midnight march peaking at over 3,000 participants proceeded down Toronto's main street. This was also the year that Lesbian and Gay Pride Day was established in Toronto, though they were not endorsed by the city until 1991. There were raids of these were the raids of the Toronto bathhouses, gay and lesbian strip clubs, and the nightclubs. All of these continued into 2000. Andy Warhol, hopefully these are now some names that you're more familiar with, was inspired by drag queens and their glamorous work. The AGO had an Andy Warhol exhibit a little while ago. I hope some of you saw it. It was marvelous. I was just walking through and just crying. He saw these performers dedicate their lives to essentially a real-life costumed drama that played with ideas and standards of beauty and what they meant and what they didn't mean. He shot drag queens with the same camera he shot Moroccan and Norwegian royalty in the decades to follow. Pictured here is one of his stars, Candy Darling. Placing trans women and drag queens into his images and films, Warhol exposed a very, very wide audience to their beauty, to their elegance, to their wit, and to the glamour of it all. DJ David Moscano, frustrated with the mainstream club culture, threw an invitation-only party in his New York City loft. Disco, helmed by queer artists and people of color, spread into a worldwide phenomenon by the mid-1970s. Bottom left, the Coquettes began as a hippie commune. Fashioned glittery costumes, they put on plays. Before them, drag was largely hidden from outside the gay community. Now, Divine and John Waters, we'll see up in the top, up here, were a cult film team that shared a love for trashy counterculture. They created a queer art collective called the Dreamlanders and began to work on a series of trashy shorts. They built a reputation as the art world's most fabulous, provocative freaks. What a title to have. Divine's most notable portrayal is in Pink Flamingos. Anybody know it? If you don't, you should go watch it. Her character stops while strutting down the street, picks up, and following, eats a handful of dog poop. Really way to get an audience's attention, right? This teen duo also created Hairspray in 1968, which inspired the Broadway musical and the 2007 remake movie. Artists of this era, like Grace Jones, like Prince, like David Bowie, they added theatricality while presenting in ways that were contrary to the ways that people expected. These are all names and presentations I'm sure you've heard of. Bowie and Prince rocking feminine attire and gender bending in their performance, questioning what being a male star actually meant. Grace Jones emulated masculine energy with her buzz cut and androgynous silhouettes, and she's been shutting down intrusive questions regarding her gender and sexuality, all while modeling and having a successful music career. The Rocky Horror Picture Show, here's a fun one. This was first created as a stage musical in 1973 and led to the 1975 film remake, which was pulled together in just 6 weeks, believe it or not. The film combines glam rock, sci-fi, horror, and absurdity under the draw of Frankenfurter, a sweet transvestite, as it were. While first critics largely ignored the film, programmers began screening them at their midnight cult slot, which attracted crowds who would sing along, ad-lib, and dance in the aisles. These are the screenings that are still popular today. With this show, glamour was never the aim. The aim was to shock. The aim was to freak you out. The aim was to off-put new fans while opening their minds to the possibility of breaking some rules. The New York City Club Kids that we're seeing here were a group of dance club personalities in the 80s and 90s. In the early 90s, there were said to be about 750 members at different levels. Their aesthetic emphasized outrageousness, being fabulous, and of course, sex. To the club kids, gender was fluid and everything was DIY. This was known as the gender fuck genre of drag. Elaborate costumes and outlandish face paint created looks that were barely human, never mind gendered. At the height of their cultural popularity, they toured the US. We see lots of influences in the drag community still today here in Toronto. The movement's decline, however, happened when two of the promoters of the group were arrested and the original group disbanded in the mid-1990s. Here are some influences in Canada during this time. The We Demand rally was held on August 28, 1971 in Ottawa. These gay groups gathered on Parliament Hill to demand recognition of equal rights for gays and lesbians in Canada. Before Pride in Vancouver, the GATE formed in 1971, the Gay Alliance Toward Equality. There was an emphasis on militant and aggressive strategies to attain gay and lesbian civil rights. They held public protests and marches, and they also created a gay newspaper called Gay Time. Le Front de Libération des Homosexuels formed in Montreal in 1971. Where's the French? There it is up there. This was the first gay liberation movement in all of Quebec. When the organization moved to a new location in June 1972, they were raided by police over and over and over again. Over 3 dozen members continually were arrested. Gays of Ottawa was founded in September 1971. Gays for Equality was formerly the campus gay club at the University of Manitoba, and then became a public organization in Winnipeg in 1972, 1973. So we see a lot of movement happening in our country at this time as well. Some coffee. This is an important piece of history here. It's all important. But the arts of charisma and influence since the 1980s AIDS crisis, drag performers have been sent in a more political and even more radical way than ever before. Misunderstandings around HIV and AIDS gripped Canadians as much as it did the US. We don't like to talk about it, but it's true. Only in late 2022, less than 8 months ago, the final legs of the blood bands were removed from men who have sex with men. Formerly, these men were not allowed to donate blood. Mind you, we've had a blood shortage for how many years? The first decade of the HIV/AIDS epidemic was marked by government inaction. In 1990, Brian Mulroney established an HIV/AIDS strategy that included treatment funding, and in 1996, the 11th International AIDS Conference, held in Vancouver, highlighted that the discovery of highly active form of antiviral therapy was announced. This transformed HIV and AIDS from a necessarily fatal to a chronic illness, over a decade after the epidemic started. AIDS activists were fighting across the country the entire decade before those developments were made, only to be met with silence from the government level. Millions of people died because the government in our country and in the US refused to take any action at all. The relative neglect of state health agencies in the early years of the epidemic placed the burdens of care on local gay networks that could easily have overwhelmed them, and for many it did. It was in 1988, some history in my church life, that the United Church of Canada's General Council voted that a homosexual orientation would not be a bar to ordination. That came before the government acted in the AIDS epidemic. Just sort of placing that in history for you. Now here we get into some more performers that are A, still alive, and B, still doing what they're doing. In the top center, we have Lady Buddy, this Lady Bunny. This is a drag queen who was the founder of a day-long drag festival called Wigstock. This festival lasted until 2001, and she was a part of the New York City club kids scene where she worked and made community. Amanda Lepore top left here, made a name for herself working as a dominatrix and being a very glamorous club kid during the movement. She self-titles the world's most famous transsexual. That's what she likes to call herself. She became a hyper-exaggerated replica of Andy Warhol's Marilyn Monroe. She blends hyper-femininity with charisma and glamour to make herself an icon. And she's still going. She's still just as fabulous as ever. Miss Tiffany's Universe is a beauty pageant in Thailand for transgender women. It happens yearly, first launching in 1984 to combat the assumptions by police and bystanders that trans women were always sex workers and therefore were always targeted. Visual Kei, down here, is a rock genre defined by androgyny in Japan. Similar to Prince and Bowie, 80s artists leaned towards femininity and embraced the romantic style, frills, gothic looks. These artists helped to formulate a new brand of masculinity, if not drag. Moby Dick founded Club Casanova, which was the world's first weekly drag king party in 1995. He eventually took Casanova out on tours that sparked the drag king phenomenon in the mid-1990s. Drag artists aren't just underground provocateurs or showcases anymore. We are high-profile activists and community keystones. Thanks to the rise of various pieces of media, we are on the front a lot of the time. So in contemporary history, July 20th, 2005 is when Canada passes federal law allowing same-sex marriage. All of you were adults at that point in time, I'm sure. March 2013, the House of Commons passed a bill that amended the Canadian Rights Act and the Criminal Code to extend human rights protections to trans people in Canada. I was in high school. This was huge. These are some pieces of media that are still going on and providing some highlights of drag and this sort of art form in our world. The Boulet Brothers Dragula, up here, is a drag competition show that specializes in horror, in filth, in disgusting. Think of Divine and John Waters, right? A series full of campy scares and a freaky and glamorous drag aesthetic. In one of the finales of one of the episodes, I'm going to spoil it a little bit for you, one of the performers came out in this really intricate, glamorous costume, again, freaky. And part of their performance as part of the finale was making themselves vomit on the stage. It was part of this whole performance, though, right? Of freaky, of gross. And that's the whole point. Conchita Wurst, down here, became the first drag winner of Eurovision in 2014. Pose here is set in, up there, is set in 1986 and looks at the ballroom scene in New York City, finding community in people who are like you and those who are different. They describe balls as gatherings of people who are not welcome to gather elsewhere. Legendary, here is another ball battle show, unfortunately, has been stopped, but all the seasons are still available. Each episode is a different ball, and the different houses are the contestants in that show. They battle through voguing, they battle through fashion, they battle through attitude. Drag has made its way from stages to screens all around the world, changing the social norms and expectations as they go. Drag artists around the world are asking each and every audience member, each and every person that we interact with, to live a little. Open up to the idea that there's some mystery here about gender, about presentation, about attraction that's unattainable. What a divine mystery this all is, no? Where else are we asked to open up to the idea that there's mystery we don't understand? This is something very fun that I've been learning about recently after I started to do the work that I'm doing. Clown ministry. I don't know if any of you are familiar about it, but apparently it's been this huge thing that's been going on for a really long time. Clown ministry isn't just about entertainment, actually, though, nor is it preaching in a costume. The clown is an enabler, right? The clown frees us from ourselves. The clown, the entire person, dares us as as congregation members, as observers, to be bigger than life. A true clown develops from within. Maybe you have a clown in there you need to develop. I don't know, I won't stop you. The clown develops from within, from an inner warmth, from an intense desire to give pleasure, to make whole persons out of broken bits and pieces. Does that not sound like ministry? A clown is interracial, a clown is ageless, a clown is genderless, vulnerable with the audience, with the congregation, with the people around them. The clown is someone who can be trusted. The clown knows about and respects personal space. If you've seen clown performance, you know it's very like, you know, can I come closer? Maybe I'll come back here. The clown minister, in a Christian context, has faith in God, has faith in humanity, has faith in himself. By presenting faith to the audience and offering trust and engaging in a trustful relationship, the clown shows that they're willing to share in that trust with their community. The clown isn't just a symbol of joy, but a symbol of hope as well. Clowns refuse to accept the limits of what is possible. They dare to make dreams come true. In the clown, there's always some kind of hope. The clown is a servant figure as well, relieving tension, enabling the audience to relax, enabling the audience to obtain maybe a new perspective. The clown minister, in that sense, gives a little tug at rigid traditions, bending them just enough to keep them traditional, but also put them in touch with humanity as we are, here and now. Strange, isn't it? That the qualities that are all the earmarks of a successful clown, faith and hope and love and trust and joy, all seem to be ingredients to a happy life. The clown in this way embodies 1 Corinthians 13:13. So faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Drag, as a boundary-pushing, fantasy-creating, community-building, soul-healing art form, belongs in God's house. Judith Butler writes from the perspective that gender is socially constructed. Maybe you've heard this before. And that the conventional notions of gender and sexuality inherently submit women to men and have over time. They also say that these same conventional notions of gender and sexuality are what people use to justify homophobia and transphobia and all these other things. They reinvigorate the gender conversation with their ideas that gender is actually made of what a person says and does. Ergo, a performance that the person is putting on. It could even be said that Judith Butler was saying gender is an illusion that one puts on, right? They're talking about each and every person here, not just drag artists, not just clowns, not just queer people. If we frame our way of thinking to think that gender is a performance, even when you're not in drag, the lines that are seemingly keeping you boxed in open widely. And in that way, we begin to question what our gender performance may look like. Now I'm going to pose a question. It's time for some audience engagement here, I think. What is a way that you perform your gender on an average day? What does that look like for you? Just shout.
I work in school with kids with disabilities, kids like average classes. The way that manifests my gender is being polite, being gentle, being kind, being caring. That's the way. Even first thing, to greet, nice, to smile, that's my way.
Did everybody hear that? Okay, I can repeat. Okay. Yeah, I can repeat. Oh, we'll repeat it for the people online. Someone was saying that caring for children and cooking and being kind and generous and courteous is a way that you perform your gender.
Yeah.
And polite, yes.
Empathetic.
Empathetic, beautiful. Other people. Maybe how you act, maybe how you dress, maybe what you read, maybe what you watch on TV. How do you perform yourself? Maybe the way you style your hair, maybe the kind of bag you carry, maybe what kind of jewelry you wear. I'm not going to call on anybody, but I sure am going to wait until someone else responds. Yeah.
It's interesting because there's all that, and that was hidden for me. I didn't even think about it. But now that I'm thinking more about it, it's because I'm older, and I think that because I'm a woman, I feel that I dye my hair to kind of hide the gray. But if I was a man, I know for sure, like I wouldn't.
Yeah.
So there's just that example for me.
Yeah.
In the social box.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, exactly.
The social box of performing womanhood as somebody without gray or white hair.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
The social box that women are inherently not supposed to age, but men age well.
Exactly.
Yeah. Maybe one of the men in the room would like to say something. Wink, wink.
Maybe you don't age so well if they die.
And maybe that's a part of performing manhood. You're dying younger. I don't know.
That's interesting, what we mean by gender, right? So, are certain behaviors gender-based? Is it part of, society, social, like the clothes we wear, things we do, certainly physical things that I would do that I would say, okay, is this because I'm performing male gender, or is it something I've just been socialized into? It's hard to say.
Yeah. I'm going to give a little example here of an action. I'm sitting on the TTC. Okay, that's what this is. If I'm performing femininity, perhaps, and I'm sitting on the TTC, maybe I'm sitting like this, or my legs are crossed, or my legs are crossed like this. If I'm performing masculinity on the TTC, how it's very commonly performed, right? See many head nods around here. You see a woman sitting like this, or somebody presenting feminine sitting like this, it feels off-putting, doesn't it? But it's just the way I'm sitting, right? What does that actually say about me at all? Anybody else?
Well, just to, it's curious here. Look around the women in the room, and perhaps the vast majority being female. That's part of the performance of women showing an interest in this kind of thing. But I see all the women, perhaps it's all of them wearing pants. Now, it wasn't so long ago, but that would have been awfully. So things are much more fluid than we sometimes acknowledge.
Yeah. Or much more fluid than they used to be. A comment was made that many, if not all, of the women in the room are wearing pants. And not so long ago, that would have been off-putting. Maybe you would have been put in a loony bin. I don't know.
There was an accounting firm that would not hire you as a woman unless you wore a skirt.
Yeah.
That was
Places you wouldn't get hired if you wouldn't get a skirt. Only in my time as a teenager working in a restaurant in BC did they finally outlaw it and say that servers actually shouldn't be wearing heels while they're running food in restaurants. 2016.
I was just going to say, I wish I could pull up some of the details on this. About over 15 years ago, I did some university courses, and one was sex and gender from the University of Guelph. And the one thing that struck me that we learned was that your
two men, there was still a man there to keep it intact, right? If the relationship is between two women, what are they going to do?
The other thing I wanted to add is just, you were talking about clowns and how clowns uplift. And a couple of months ago, I saw an old movie, La Strada, 1954. And you might want to look into it because there was a clown figure in that movie that uplifts this very sad life. I think it takes place in Italy or Greece, very poor people, and a mother sells her daughter to a man who's a traveler because she can't afford to feed her. And the woman is probably in her 20s, and the man she marries is, he's very, very hard on her. It's really a dreadful life. But the clown is an inspiring character in this. And to your point about how they uplift, you might enjoy it. Anybody else might, I've just been Googling it.
Yeah.
Estrada, and it did, was it sorry. It did, it was a Fellini picture, 1954, La Strada.
Like La Strada?
La Strada.
La Strada, okay.
Like the street.
Yeah.
Perfect. I'll repeat this for people. There's a film recommendation from the 50s, La Strada, a clown film about uplifting. And to your previous point, they were saying that a lot of what we know about gender and how we perform it and how we go is about how we've been taught, right? How we've been taught by our family members, how we've been taught by the church, what you're taught in school. The boys are allowed to go be crazy in the back of the room. They're just being boys, right? The girls have to sit here and be polite because that's what girls do. All of these things to think about. And another one that's quite funny that I think about all the time. How many of you use exclamation points in your emails? Yeah. I always have that moment of, am I using too many exclamation points? Am I just really excited? Or is this, and that's something I find that a lot of femme people deal with. Of, am I being too excited in this email? Am I being too nice? How frequently, to the women in the room, do you find yourself apologizing for things that you don't even need to be apologizing for?
This is what Canadian people are famous for.
Well, Canadian people, but especially in the feminine context, so much is ingrained in feminine upbringing that, oh, sorry to interrupt. Sorry, I'm just going to take this. Sorry, can I sit here? So much of that is ingrained in us. And of course, culturally, things vary, right? Generationally, things vary. There were things growing up that my great-grandmother would do, and I'm like, I would never do that. Thanks, Granny. No thanks. Not doing that. So, I invite you to think about that, and continue thinking about that, also in respect to these conversations around all-gender bathrooms, for example. None of you said, I'm a woman because I have this body part. I don't perform my womanhood by having this body part. Same for the men in the room. I don't consider myself a man because I was born with this set of chromosomes and this set of body parts. I'm a man because of how I dress. I'm a man because I sit like this on the TTC. I'm a man because I listen to rock and roll. Right? I want you to think about that. What does that mean? When you see somebody dressed a certain way, what do you actually know about them? I'm going to tell you, it's nothing. You can tell maybe a bit of their fashion sense. Maybe not if they're wearing an outfit someone dared them to wear, right? You don't know. Most of you in this room, I don't know you. That's okay. Most of you in this room don't know me. We don't really know anything about each other. But for a lot of the times, I'm assuming a lot of you in this room People will assume that you're a woman by looking at you. And for a few of you in this room, I'm sure people will assume that you're a man by looking at you. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe some of you who are women who have long hair, you put it up sometimes, or you put it in a hat, or your hair is really short. Maybe people then assume you're performing masculinity. But for you, in your womanhood, that's the way you're performing your womanhood. What do we know? What do we know about other people? Nothing, until they tell us. So Judith Butler, in their following writings, we can read a quote here from Judith Butler saying that drag specifically is the site of ambivalence that reflects on the systems of power that we're actively opposing, but we're inherently stuck with and stuck within. This is referring possibly to hegemonic or idealized identities, capitalism, consumerism, white supremacy, etc., etc., etc. Drag performers use these systems and abuse them very frequently with their performances, explicitly to get their point across. While the point is to abolish the system entirely, that's the end goal. We want to abolish white supremacy, we want to abolish capitalism, we want to abolish the police. We still have to live and work within these systems somehow. So how can we live and work within a system without using it, without somehow harming somebody else? At best, it seems drag is a site of the ambivalence, one which reflects the more general situation of being implicated in the regimes of power by which one is constituted, and hence of being implicated in the very regimes of power that one opposes. In this space, here and now, as people who maybe are involved with the Presbyterian Church, who maybe are involved with a school, who maybe are involved with the government, who maybe are involved with the police, sorry if you are. You may or may not be affiliated with any organization or any organized religion at all. Some of you may or may not have read some Judith Butler. No. We can read these things, and I'm sure there's already similarities pinging off in your brain. Both between these two examples here, maybe between some of the things that we're talking about in this space, but I'm sure that also there are some similarities popping up for you between these examples and what we've talked about when we talk about drag. Is drag not passionate about social justice? About community in diversity? Do drag artists not put their radical beliefs into solid actions that you can see? Drag culture is all about celebrating the paradox of unity in diversity. Queer culture is nothing but that. Each and every single one of us is our own unique person and artist, but we can still come together in ways that are fabulous, in ways that are glamorous, in ways that are freaky and weird and meaningful. We can still come together and care about each other and celebrate each other. In a Christian context, one of the main uses of the word perform refers to performing, can anybody guess? Miracles, right? Performing healing, perhaps. God so often is the one doing the performing, right? In some form or another. Performing miracles, performing acts of wonder, performing in creation, performing signs for us to witness this great love. It could be argued here that performance is precisely what God is telling us to do through everything that is miraculous. God's performances take us away. God's performances provide illusion. God's performances hold a silk robe, maybe, over something that we can't and don't know. We look to God's performance. So often, maybe it hasn't been labeled that way for you, maybe you haven't thought about it that way, but we look to God's performance, a response to let us know that God is listening to us. Right? We look for winds. We look for shooting stars. We look for new life. We look for resurrection. Maybe you've asked God to break off a relationship for you if that's not the right person for you and you just don't want to do it. Maybe you've asked God to somehow get the TTC to run on time today so you can make it to your meeting and not miss it. Maybe you've asked God to say, please clear this accident, this highway is not moving. And then the cars start moving. I'm sure we've all had at least one moment like that. I'm curious if you have an example that came to mind just now. A performance of God that you've witnessed. Maybe you've seen a lightning strike. Maybe you've seen an egg hatch. Tricky question, I know.
Could you please repeat the question?
Sure. What's an example maybe of a performance of God that you've seen, that you've experienced?
It's springtime. We see it everywhere. Every leaf that is there, every greenery, every blooming flower, we see everywhere.
Yeah. Springtime is a big moment for this, right? Blooming flowers, leaves going green.
Miracles everywhere.
Miracles everywhere. Yeah.
You know, in our lives, providence is kind of like an old-fashioned, maybe other-style idea. But when fate seems to give something to you, and you don't put it down to random chance, but the care of the divine.
Yeah.
Modern medicine, my brother had open heart surgery a number of years ago. And watching what that medical team did down in Toronto General, incredible. Because they actually have to stop all the organs and just stop the body, so, and then bring it back and do this complicated surgery. And
Mm-hmm.
with all due respect, I think somebody said it's almost godlike.
Yeah.
What they do is fantastic.
Thank you. For those of you online, the comment was medicine and surgery and medical teams doing miraculous work. We had not leaving things up to random chance. I always say there's no such thing as a coincidence. Too many things happen in my life that are somehow related, or I'll be talking about something with somebody, and then the commercial that pops up in the radio is exactly for what I was just talking about. Right? So many of those things happen too. I completely agree. Yeah.
It's a little bit different, but I am very much a creature of habit.
Mm-hmm.
Many of us are. I often feel a nudge to do something different, take a different path, to alter a route. I'll give you an example. On a running route, altered the route one day and was there, seeing an accident happen and being able to help at that moment.
Yeah.
I find almost every time I feel that impulse to alter the norm, I encounter something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's very uncanny. It's a lot like hearing something and then suddenly seeing a connection to that later.
Mm-hmm.
So we listen, or I listen.
Yeah. Story that we shared was Michael's a creature of habit, and every so often we'll get a feeling, a gut instinct. Maybe I need to break my habit today, and maybe the habit is changing his running route one day and was able to witness an accident happen and be able to be there to provide help on an otherwise route that is not his. Right? God God performs for us in so many ways, and maybe we think of it that way, maybe we don't. Maybe we're just like, oh yeah, the wind's blowing today. Oh yeah, that rain, whatever. Oh yeah, the lightning strikes the CN Tower all the time. Maybe it's more than that. Why? Godliness lies in many things, right? And I think one of those things, very much so, is performance. Why are we not performing God? Performing our spirituality, performing our faith? We can live into performance of what it means, or how can we live into performance? How can we live into what that means to be a person of faith? We see here in the Colossians passage that, up there, as people of God, we must carry in us a heart so freaking compassionate that it endures and outlasts injustice and unpleasantness. We see on the other side Jesus reading from the scroll of Isaiah about his role and whom we are longing to emulate as Christians. He is here to bring good news to the poor, to pardon and forgive, to recover, to set free those who have been oppressed, those who have been downtrodden, those who have been bruised and crushed by tragedy. Throughout history, drag artists have been doing these things. You heard some of that today. Banding together with hearts so full of love for each other, they house, they feed, they dress each other, they provide medical care. They provide space for healing and for palliative care when the government is not doing anything. They create houses and family structures, mothers and fathers to each other because their blood families threw them out. They've lived into characters of social and political standings they couldn't reach in a climate just to liberate themselves and to liberate others from strict pressures they were under and show that anything is possible if they believe it. They've done all of these things while performing a role, while creating an illusion, while living a fantasy. Drag artists create their personas or their alter egos or their eventual selves with an image in mind of who they want it to be, of what they want it to be, about maybe a freak show that has no possible comprehension, they just go with it. This is God's image. God calls drag artists to be who they are, to challenge that which makes them insecure, that which oppresses them, that which bruises them and overcomes them with tragedy, to challenge what makes them self-conscious or even marginalized in these human systems that we have somehow, for some reason, created, and highlight that which makes them weird, that which makes them different. In doing that, drag artists over time and space have been the front runners in social justice fights and creating homes for people who have none. This all sounds very Jesus-like, no? I think Jesus was on the ground with the AIDS activists in the 1980s. I think he was there at Stonewall. I feel like Jesus was at that bathhouse with those gay men when they were assaulted and wrongfully arrested by the police. Jesus was with the letter writers, the poets, the activists who fought the fight so I can stand here now with you today to tell you about it. Without a threat to my life, to my livelihood, to my family. Jesus is with the trans youth across the Western world who are witnessing the increasing number of protests and laws against gender-affirming care. Jesus is with the drag performers in states like Tennessee, where it's illegal to do drag performance or cross-dress. Jesus is, and always has been, on the front lines. When I go up the steps at the front of my church, and I'm dressed like this, or some other form that my art takes, I'm doing so understanding that it's the image of God. Every piece of my creative mind is accessed through prayer, whether I do that consciously or not. And my understanding of love for oneself and for others has been redefined by the drag community I was taught about it in church, and I continue to learn about it in church, and I still learn about it as well with other queer people. I understand love, and therefore understand God in a whole new way because of drag. And because God calls me to be a drag artist and be in this community of people. I understand the divine and community love from scriptures, but learn to love for myself through drag. It only makes sense to me to bring them all together, to talk about an all-encompassing, transgressive love that knows no bounds, no matter where that love is directed. This character, my art, always tries to uncover and redistribute power towards shared liberation. Gender performativity is just the beginning, just the starting point for thinking bigger than that. I'm talking about not just using my drag to queer gender, but using it to queer spirituality too. A full embodied expression of my spirituality, my trickster, my jester, my clown, understanding of what it means to perform that which is sacred and that which is holy. With all of that, I want to hear where you are now. Where have you ended up? Where did this take you? Where did I challenge you? What stood out the most? What made no sense?
You threw a lot at us.
I did.
Sharon has given us food for thought. Every time I meet a new person, now I'm going to be thinking differently.
Thank you.
The word performance is an interesting word because I think in popular language, performance is something you put on, it's not necessarily you. And I've read a little bit of Judith Butler myself, so I know the word, and it makes sense for me in terms of how gender is something we put on, has nothing to do with, body parts or anything like that. But it's interesting because performance, like even when we started talking about God performing, it's sort of having to think in a different way because often in the popular use when you say it's sort of like is God putting on an act or something versus, which has its purpose, right? But, so it's interesting if you can, I think it's sort of challenging us to think about it in a different way.
Thank you. For those of you online, I was just mentioning that I pose a challenge a little bit to think differently about what the word performance means. And it's not always doing something inauthentic. It's not always faking something. Right? It's not always putting on a show. Yeah.
I think performance, so it's related to gift,
Mm-hmm.
and it's what you give. Performance is, think about artists. Artists are giving people, and they construct their gifts to be the best and the most creative, and channel the divine in themselves. So when we become our authentic selves, we become drawn away from the conforming option that we're given. We are, what's the word here, foreground, and there's the background, we rise out of it, and we give back to our community and the world around us.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a performance, a giving.
Thinking about performance as something you're giving, right? Yeah. Thank you. Michael.
I'll be very well because I'm near the microphone too. But the two New Testament scriptures you shared a moment ago encourage us to perform, where it says, reach people with an open heart.
Mm-hmm.
Put some of the other things behind. Perform in
court jesters were the only one that could make fun of the king and not get beheaded for it.
Most of the time.
Most of the time. Most of the time. Yeah.
Profits, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So as we think about this, and as we think about, thank you, Michael, for that point of court jesters who were the ones that brought news to the people in ways they could understand, that poked holes in what the king was doing, and the king couldn't get angry about it, otherwise it would prove the just but right. All of these sorts of intricate pieces of history that go into clowning, that go into this sort of art form, that for me sort of all meld together into why I do my ministry the way that I do. A lot of being a minister, to me, is storytelling, for one, is bringing news and stories to people in ways that they can understand. If Harris went up there and spoke in a language you didn't know, about stories you didn't know, you probably wouldn't really care what he had to say. Right? I like to think you speak to them in ways they understand. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt here. But also our job as ministers is to poke holes in that which discriminates, that oppresses, that burdens people. I've run into more ministers at protests than I have other people that I know. And I think that says something about what our job is. So to me, it all kind of comes together in a way that I embody and carry with me the queer history, some of a fraction of queer history that I shared with you today, of people that fought and experienced things that I will never have to, so that I can stand here and do this. And also my art is a really sacred spiritual practice for me. So again, it all comes together in this goofy, ridiculous little package. Anything else? Or any questions that you might have? Yeah?
I have a question, but please don't answer if you think it's too much like to ask. Thank you for sharing your experience, and you mentioned the way that you feel when you dress and prepare your artistic look, which is great and interesting and provoking and all of this, going to church. So my question is, from your own experience, because you are inside of the situation, do you feel less or diminished if you don't dress like that in your passion being a minister? Do you get my question? So my English is not so perfect, but I mean, do you feel like more powerful having that artistic power of brightness, of that clown thing of which all of us felt, or no? Because for me, the most important of every one of us is the performance through the actions and through the good that we do like every day. Like our minister, like me, like doing my simple. That's my question to you. Do you feel a different way and being less if you don't dress like that?
Thank you. I'll repeat this here. So the question is, do I feel less or some sort of diminished sense of power if I'm not in drag?
Not so powerful.
Yeah.
It's expression.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's a feeling of being less powerful, but to me, getting in drag is a spiritual practice. And so if I'm able to engage with my spiritual practice and carry it with me while I'm doing something meaningful, I feel that. Some people carry prayer beads with them. Some people maybe carry a book, or they have one of those cross in my pocket, little things. For me, this is how I do that. And so if I am going and leading a service and maybe I'm not in drag, I'm sure I'll have some kind of prayer or spiritual practice before the worship. I usually do. But this one is most meaningful to me. And so if I can do my spiritual practice, do the routine that I do, and carry it with me, same theological knowledge that I'm still going to a manual whether I'm dressed in drag or not. So I likely would preach similarly, but it's about that connection to my spirituality and to the elders that come before me. That answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to say, well, thank you first off. I first learned of you in tapestry, and since then, CBC's tapestry, and since then I've wanted to come and experience one of your experiences, I guess, for lack of a better word. And I'm really impressed. I didn't know what to expect. I appreciate that you went on the history of the drag and that, and then really essentially it's the common denominator is inclusiveness and just letting people be regardless of a multitude of things. So thank you.
Thank you. I think we've hit 2 o'clock, so if there are any other questions.
We exhausted you.
Thank you for being here, folks.
And we're very, very thankful that you gave us yourself and all this amazing information, which I'll be absorbing for a while. And I hope those of you online also will have appreciated all you've heard. Thank you, Michael, for that. And we'll continue to follow your journey through school and ministry and all that, and we will keep praying for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we're so thrilled, and hopefully we can keep doing things together. We do have a little gift. There is an envelope here, but also, somehow it just worked out. Today is a special day in another way. Walker's coronation of King Charles III. And now, you didn't tell me why is it King Julez?
So it's I've changed my name a number of times. My first drag name was very inappropriate for church spaces. And my drag has sort of morphed. I started with queen drag because that's what people know. People know drag queens. And then I met various other gender performers and drag kings and drag things and all of those people, and morphed into drag king drag, which is where I found the roots of my transition, and where I sort of started that journey for myself. And so my king drag holds a very meaningful place in my heart. And so I've kept that sort of as an homage to the artists who showed me so much, who really put in so much work, and to where I found so much of myself in my morphing art form over the years. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for coming.